Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the Global Risk Outlook for Q2 2026 from Solace Global, now a Global Guardian company, for those of you that have been keeping an eye on the news over the last 6 months. A warm welcome to those that I see some familiar faces in the attendees as well. Obviously, a hugely busy time geopolitically across the globe, lots going on at the moment, and thank you to the intelligence team for spending the time to meet together to address some of the topics that we'll be looking at today. My name is Robert Aldous, the Chief Customer Officer. For those that don't know me, I'll ask the panel to introduce themselves and what they'll be talking about today. Mark.
Hi, I'm Mark Harrington. I'm the Head of Intelligence here at Solace Global, and I'll be discussing the current threats in the Middle East alongside Julian.
Hi, I'm Julian. I'm a Senior Intelligence Analyst here, and I'll also be talking about the conflict in the Middle East, and specifically the threat towards the Gulf states.
Josh.
Hi, I'm Josh. I'm an Intelligence Analyst here at Solace Global, and I'll be talking about natural disasters, vulnerabilities, and challenges to state capacity.
And Manfredi.
I'm Manfredi. I'm also an Intelligence Analyst, and I will be talking about the upcoming World Cup.
Very hot topic indeed. The intent really is to provide you with the advice and guidance of what the current situation is now and some of the reasoning behind the current position. With a security officer hat on, what my recommendation at this point is to make sure that you have your risk frameworks and other aspects in place, that you can create the scenarios and trigger tables, etc. So you can make decisions based off the information that's provided either on a daily, weekly basis, rather than trying to predict what the future situation could be. So to that end, Mark and Julian, if you could start by perhaps Julian giving a sort of a high-level overview of the current state of the ceasefire.
Yes, of course, Rob. I mean, I'm in the rather unfortunate position of an analyst of having to speak about this today, which is a major day in the course of the ceasefire, being the last day. But essentially, following a continued blockade of the Strait of Hormuz by the US and then renewed Iranian attacks against vessels transiting the strait, the ceasefire has, in the last few days, been on the verge of collapse. Now, yesterday, President Trump announced that the ceasefire has been extended marginally, with a deadline now tomorrow evening, Washington time. So what we're seeing today is an 11th hour rush to talks in Islamabad in Pakistan, which is expected to be attended by Vice President Vance and most likely Iran's parliamentary speaker Khalibaf, although it remains unclear as of the time of me speaking right this second whether Iran will send a delegation at all. So the bottom line up front fundamentally is there remain heavy incentives for both the US and Iran to extend the ceasefire, but any agreement is unlikely to resolve multiple key sources of continued instability, and any extension of the ceasefire is likely to remain fundamentally fragile. Washington likely calculated that by continuing to blockade the strait, this could compel compliance for a quick and easy deal, the kind of deal Trump really likes. But Washington is highly likely working on shorter timelines than Tehran is, and Tehran likely calculates, particularly due to the influences of hardliners now, they would ultimately prefer to escalate a confrontation rather than be seen as conceding to the US. But with last-minute talks now potentially underway in Islamabad within potentially this evening, we could either see an extension of the ceasefire or a total collapse of it.
Julian, just to extend that point a little bit further, what's been the main points of the fragility in the ceasefire, and I suppose what are these potential continued sources of instability?
Yes, the two main sources of fragility so far I'd like to highlight is firstly Lebanon, which Iran saw as part of the ceasefire, but was not seen likewise by the US and Israel. But this was somewhat resolved with the agreement between Israel and Lebanon of a 10-day ceasefire last Thursday. But that ceasefire is already marked by accusations of violations. Hezbollah wasn't involved in the talks. And fundamentally, a breakdown in the Lebanon ceasefire threatens a broader ceasefire in the Middle East. The second issue, which is more globally relevant, is the Strait of Hormuz. I think it's important to emphasize that it's highly likely being a long-term strategic objective for Tehran to exercise control over the strait, and the conflict has effectively enabled this. Tehran is likely incentivized to continue to get income from that control of that longer term, but that's fundamentally a red line for Washington. And this dispute over the strait has almost certainly led to the threat of ceasefire collapse in the last few days, because we saw the foreign minister of Iran make a statement that the strait is open following the Lebanon ceasefire, but this was not reciprocated by the Americans at the end of the blockade. So Iran subsequently resumed fire against vessels in the strait, and the US seized an Iran-flagged vessel. Now, these issues, along with the nuclear file, which has been the only issue Tehran has been willing to move on so far in negotiations, may be potentially addressable with a combination of US pressure and negotiations. But I would argue that there are continued sources of instability that are highly unlikely to be addressable through negotiations. So first, we have Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, which Mark will go into more detail on. Second, we have Iran's support for its regional proxies. And third, which I'll focus a little bit on, the likely consolidation of power in Iran by the hardline Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps or IRGC commanders, such as Major General Vahidi. Just to focus on this, a key question needs to be asked: who are the US even negotiating with? Because these political figures in Iran, such as President Pezeshkian, the Foreign Minister Araghchi, or the Parliamentary Speaker Ghalibaf, they're likely not exercising full command and control over the IRGC, or even potentially even Iran's negotiating position. Instead, it's likely that these commanders and Vahidi, just to note, is reportedly the only senior official in Iran with direct access to the new supreme leader. It's likely that these figures are now exercising significant control over the regime and effectively acting as a key block on the ability of these political figures to make any concessions in negotiations.
And Julian, you talk about in your third points here on the slide, but in terms of with the ceasefire so fragile, could you describe the trends that we saw with recent strikes against Gulf states?
There's two things I want to highlight here. First of all, the variable impact between them, and also the evolving nature of what constituted a high-value target, or HVT, for the Iranians since the current conflict began on the 28th of February. So firstly, I think it's really important to note that not all of the Gulf states were targeted equally. So one trend I'll observe of this is that the scale of Iranian targeting broadly corresponded to that Gulf state's prior relations with Iran and also Israel. So Oman, which was targeted the least, was the mediator, and the attacks that were done by Iran were actually denied by Tehran. This facilitated, by the way, Oman's role as an evacuation hub for the region. Excluding Oman, Qatar had the lowest total number of projectiles launched at it and was the only Gulf state to record no deaths, although Qatar did likely suffer potentially the longest term strategic impact due to the strikes against Ras Laffan gas fields. On the other side of the coin, we have the UAE, which had the largest scale of attacks, actually, in terms of number of projectiles in the entire Middle East from Iran, and the most deaths of any of the Gulf states. Now, prior to the conflict, the UAE was notably hostile with Iran and particularly friendly relative to the region with Israel. The other point I wanted to highlight was the level of deterrence posed by a Gulf state conditioning Iranian targeting. Saudi Arabia is the perfect example for this, because following in the initial phases of the conflict, Saudi Arabia was actually only targeted minimally. Then this increased dramatically to be second only to the UAE, and then this lowered again following talk of Riyadh potentially joining the war. The final point I wanted to talk about is how HVTs, or high-value targets for Iran, evolved through the conflict. So at the start of the conflict, we had major targeting of US military bases like Al-Dafra or Al-Udeid, or the 5th Navy headquarters in Manama, and also areas where US personnel were located, which notably did include international hotels, as we saw in Manama. But as the course of the conflict went on, there was this cycles of retaliatory escalation, which in turn led to increasingly civilian profile targets being hit. So the first key one I wanted to highlight is the assassination of Iranian leaders. During the course of the conflict, this led to retaliatory strikes. It's highly notable that the killing of the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, in the very first strikes of the war was highly likely what was the key trigger for what we saw in such maximalist retaliation from Tehran. Then there was strikes against Iranian banks. This highly likely led to attempted attacks against, for example, Dubai's financial zone, and the issuance of threats against American corporations across the region. Then there was, as I previously mentioned, strikes on Iran's South Pars gas field, led to retaliation against oil and gas across the region, including Qatar's Ras Laffan. And then finally, Trump's ultimatum threats against power plants in Iran. This led to published lists in IRGC-linked media of power and desalination plants, which are often dual purpose, across the region. And it's notable that desalination plants are really critical for water security in the region. Now, on that just very last point, I'll just finish with this. It's important to note that just as recently as yesterday, Trump was threatening to bomb every power plant and every bridge in Iran should they not agree to a deal. And this has already led to threats of retaliation, that Iran will abandon its previous apparent restraints exercised in the first round of war, particularly regarding the Bab al-Mandeb, which closed to the Houthis, the Saudi oil giant Aramco, the Saudi Red Sea terminal Yanbu, and the Emirati city of Fujairah by name.
Julian, thank you. I'll move on to the nenext slide, if I may, and then on to bring Mark into the conversation. Mark, what have been the main threats to civilians and travellers? A lot of people on the line obviously worried about their corporate travellers or staff abroad, the travellers in the Gulf from Iran's recent military campaigns.
As Julian sort of suggested, we've got maybe as long as 48 hours before this gets kinetic again. So I'll just address what sort of weapon systems Iran has and what the threats are. So Iran's most dangerous long-range conventional military threat is its ballistic missile inventory, which lies with the IRGC aerospace forces. With Iran assessed as having somewhere in the range of 2,000 to 3,000 ballistic missiles in its pre-war inventory, involving thousands of short-range ballistic missiles, which can range from 300 kilometers to 1,000, with even the shortest range ones capable of hitting practically all of the Gulf Coast. As well as thousands of medium-range ballistic missiles classified by ranges of around 1,000 to 3,000 kilometers, with the most capable of these systems able to strike the entirety of the Gulf, but often not used for that as a reserve for striking of Israel. How many ballistic missiles Iran has left is unknown, despite high rates of expenditure and US and Israeli joint fires. Most estimates suggest that hundreds, possibly 1,000 remain, although by exact variant is even more unknown. But I think I'll just go into how ballistic missiles work, and that gives a sort of context of the sort of underlying threat. Ballistic missiles follow what's known as a parabolic or curved flight path and consist of three primary stages: the boost, the mid-course, and the terminal. Now, the boost phase is when missile rockets are thrust. The launch system will fire that missile system, produce a really obvious heat or infrared signature, which is easy to detect by satellite, and thrust that missile into the atmosphere, where it then enters the mid-course, which when the missile then coasts through space towards a target area. And then the most important phase, arguably, is that terminal phase, where the missile re-enters and descends to the target at extreme speeds. Most Iranian ballistic missiles sit around Mach 4 to 7 when they re-enter the atmosphere, with Mach 5 plus being classified as hypersonic, making it hard to intercept and detect for that matter. Just provide that context, as I'll come back to that in a bit, but pivot towards regional air defences, because this really provides some context to what threats are really being exposed to on the ground. Now, obviously, the best defence really here is destroy the ballistic missile launch systems and missile production facilities, which Israel and the United States have been doing at a really high rate. And this is quite not particularly challenging for them, as these missile signatures during that boost phase are really easy to detect and provide near real-time targeting data, which has resulted in hundreds of missile launch systems being destroyed, damaged almost immediately after firing. However, hundreds do remain in play, and Iran has managed to sustain its attacks, albeit at a lower volume, and is currently digging out and repairing some of these launch systems that have previously been damaged or buried. But this threat has been known for decades, really. Iran's been building this threat for quite some time, and the Gulf states have invested heavily in advanced ground-based air defense systems like Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, THAAD, and Patriot surface-to-air missile systems, both of which are advanced US-derived air defense systems, Patriot having some ballistic capability and some other in addition to that. But while these systems are highly advanced and capable of intercepting ballistic missiles traveling at hypersonic speeds, they're only capable of intercepting missiles in the terminal phase, not in the mid-course phase. Now, this is incredibly important. If these systems are capable of intercepting ballistic missiles in the mid-course, then they'll be able to interdict them when they're traveling over a low-threat area, such as the Persian Gulf. Unfortunately, as the interception occurs in the terminal phase, there's a much shorter window to detect, track, and engage, with the high speeds of these missiles significantly compressing reaction times. So this results in interceptions at much lower altitudes, which also reduces the sort of geographical horizontal engagement range. with missiles often intercepted only kilometers from the intended target, or sometimes even much closer. And this is primarily actually the primary threat rather than direct missile impact, as it poses a really high threat to anyone operating on the ground within that engagement envelope, as the interceptions produce that secondary effect of missile debris, both from the missile itself and the interceptor munition falling over or near defended areas, with the vast majority of people in the Gulf actually killed by debris and not the actual missile impacts. So if I move on to the next slide, sorry, Rob, and we'll cover accuracy just quickly, because this is another major concern. So just introduce this concept quickly, known as circular error probable, or CEP, which is used to describe missile accuracy. So the CEP is simply the radius of a circle around a target within which 50% only of missiles are expected to land. So a CEP of 500 meters means that about half of the missiles fired at that target are expected to land within 500 meters, while the remaining 50% could fall significantly further outside of that radius. Now, what we know previously and observed in this conflict is Iranian ballistic missiles have very low CEP values compared to comparable Western systems. Some of them are fairly decent, as you see on the table on the bottom right-hand side. They have CEPs of 10 to 30 meters, but many of them have 500 meters, some of them as high as 2,500 meters. What this means that if an Iranian missile manages to bypass or penetrate adversarial air defenses and reach the target area, there's a higher chance of off-target impacts. Simply put, it misses its intended target and lands somewhere 500, 1,000 meters away from it, which is obviously a very high risk to anyone operating on the ground, especially in populated areas. So that combined effect of poor CEP values and the interceptions happening at lower altitudes means that physical distance from an assessed target does not always necessarily translate to safety to anyone in the region. Now, of course, I can't talk about Iranian attacks without covering UAVs quickly, so I'll move on to those quickly. There's limited value illustrating the ranges. Basically, most capable attack UAVs have been designed to reach Israel ranges up to 2,500 kilometers, meaning they can reach the entirety of the Gulf. What's critical to note here is that Iran had 80 to 100,000 attack UAVs before the conflict, with tens of thousands remaining in play. These systems are typically launched in large waves to saturate air defenses and identify exploitable vulnerabilities for future attacks, and also impose a cost on adversaries as they're so cheap compared to the systems used to intercept them. But critically, they're very slow, low-flying, and small enough, producing small radar cross-sections, making them very difficult to detect, classify, and this results in late-stage detection, often compressing engagement timelines, with multiple examples of Gulf states having to fire advanced air defenses at something so cheap when multiple other systems could have interdicted this threat. Again, this results in the secondary effect of debris, particularly during mass attacks when they're often fired in waves of dozens at a target area. Although I will say that the Gulf states have rapidly looked to improve their UAV defenses and have looked to Ukraine for systems and expertise.
Mark, assuming, just building on from what Julian said and what you've said here as well, assuming a restart in hostilities and potentially weeks, months of conflict, how do you see these threats evolving?
The main thing is to just assume for worst case scenario, this does go on for several months, but best for planning. And I think there's 4 points I'd like to draw out. Number one is, can Iran produce ballistic missiles under wartime conditions? Probably to some degree, yes. Particularly less sophisticated, shorter range systems that are cheaper and have less complex supply chains. So that threat will not go away completely, but will certainly curtail. Number two, can Iran produce UAVs at any rate under wartime conditions? Well, it was making about 400 a day before the war, so I think it's highly likely it'll be able to mass produce UAVs to some extent. Number three, how well are regional air defences going to maintain defensive operations? Now, there's a high chance of them being depleted, interceptor mission stocks, that is. And I don't think that production of interceptors will meet demands necessarily, especially with wars going elsewhere in the world. And fourth, Iran may increasingly receive external support from countries hostile to the United States, such as Russia and China, whether that be financial, material, or things like intelligence. So collectively, this could result in a worst case scenario in where we see Iran's ability to sustain attacks degrades at a slower rate than Allied capacity to maintain defensive operations, which would obviously increase the risk to the Gulf countries if air defense is overstretched or limited, especially if Iran pivots to cheaper, shorter range systems that can be fired en masse. I'll just bring out quickly early indicators and warnings of what we think could be indications of a deteriorating situation or threat environment in the Gulf. And that would be clear examples of air defense shortages and higher penetration rates despite smaller attack waves, shorter interval times before attacks, a shift in targeting pattern from precise strikes on high-value targets to wider disruption, or even worst-case scenario civilian areas. Although I think that's unlikely without a major escalation. Fourthly, Gulf states' active involvement in the war. They have at least implicitly threatened this, and they can't sustain these attacks forever. And lastly, Houthi involvement, as this would offer more mass in terms of attack and also provide more attack corridors, which is going to overstretch adversarial air defenses or Gulf state air defenses. And then I think the last point I'll make is we should not assume that a pause in attacks is the same as a pause in operations. All parties, but especially Iran, have likely exploited this ceasefire to pre-stage, reposition and disperse units, refine targeting practice, and exploit any vulnerabilities identified during the earlier phases of this conflict. And many are going to be placed in a better position if or when attacks resume, potentially increasing at least a short-term risk in the Gulf if suddenly the balloons go up again.
Mark, thank you. Obviously, topic we could go on and on about, and I know you're writing a lot more about this on our weekly intelligence reporting, as well as advising clients. So thank you for that different angle of viewpoint as well around the weaponry. Different topic completely, but I'm sure we'll have some effects and ripples onto this, the World Cup 2026, between local threats and global instability. Just opening this, can you highlight some of the baseline threats across the three host countries and how these countries have different threat landscapes, Manfredi?
Just to give a brief introduction about the World Cup, not that it needs a lot of a long introduction. It is arguably the largest sporting event in the world. It's usually watched by slightly less of half of the world's population, so viewership that is counted in the billions. And this edition, which will take place between the 11th of June and the 19th of July, is billed as the largest ever. It will take place across three countries: Canada, the US, and Mexico, and it will have 48 teams participating, 60 more than the previous total of 32, for a total of 104 matches. And early estimates assess that the 6.5 million people will visit the World Cup, the 16 cities hosting World Cup games during the event. Now, of course, Canada, the US, and Mexico are three very different countries. Here at Solace, we assess Canada to be overall a low risk destination, the US to be a moderate risk destination, and Mexico to be a moderate to high risk destination, depending on the city. But there are some baseline threats that are shared or will be affected by the World Cup in different ways across the three countries. So starting with crime is probably the threat that most travelers will be most concerned about. There are statistical studies that indicate a strong correlation between petty and opportunistic crime and other property offenses and large-scale sporting events. So this is definitely something that we will see as a major threat at the host cities during the days of the event. However, we're observing in the last few years different differentiation in terms of the type of property crimes, especially associated with these events. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen, for example, a rise in luxury property crimes that often target high net untrustworthy individuals. And this is a very sophisticated form of crimes where criminals, for example, will conduct scouting ahead of targeting their victims, using, for example, their social media footprints ahead of targeting them in order to target fewer victims but obtain considerably larger monetary income from their thefts. Of course, because we're talking about the World Cup, and participation and booking will include online procedures, cybercrime is likely to be one of the major threats associated with traveling to the World Cup. Canadian authorities in late 2025 already identified more than 4,000 spoofed domains tending to be associated with official World Cup channels, but then are used to install malware or steal information from victims that use them. Related to cybercrime, there's this growing threat from AI. AI can be used by cyber criminals, for example, to increase the volume of personalized phishing emails or other forms of cyber threats that can target attendees. And finally, the World Cup occurs at a time where the organized crime landscape is changing considerably, especially in Mexico. The Mexican cartels are under extreme pressure from both the Mexican and US governments, which have notably culminated in February with the killing of El Mencho, the leader of the CJNG, which is arguably the largest cartel in Mexico, but also because of the splintering of the Sinaloa cartel, which is the other major cartel in Mexico. So all of these factors are likely to create a very complex and changing crime threat landscape during the events. The second major threat category that I'd like to talk about is civil unrest. Because of the high exposure that is associated with the World Cup and other events, they tend to attract large-scale protests as well as smaller protests carried out by activist groups. There are several drivers for foreign policy, and we'll talk about geopolitics later, I'm sure. But also domestic developments within the host countries. For example, in the US, the World Cup happens just a few months before the crucial midterms vote in November, whereas in Mexico, the World Cup happens at a time where the cost of living crisis has driven considerable civil unrest. We can think about the last year's anti-expat protest that took place in the summer in Mexico City and at times even turned violent. Of course, this is pertaining to large-scale protests, but we can also think about small-scale protests and actions meant to disrupt the World Cup itself. This is something that could mirror what we've seen before the Olympics in France, where groups that were opposed to the Olympics staged several actions of sabotage to try and disrupt the events. We're already seeing something like this in the sense that there are several groups opposing the World Cup that are staging, for now, small-scale localized protests meant to disrupt the events or the preparations for the event. An example of this would be the anti-World Cup Days, which is a weekly protest going on in Mexico City, during which one of the main highways next to the stadium is being blockaded. There are, of course, other protest vectors, including, for example, environment-related issues or other more long-standing trends in protest. For example, we can think of the university campuses protest against the war in Gaza, which have been observed in the US and Canada especially. A final kinetic threat that I would like to talk about is terrorism. Again, precisely because of the extremely large viewership of the World Cup, it is a very desirable target for terrorist groups that often seek to maximize exposure for their actions. Now, the major threat will likely come from Islamist jihadist groups. For example, the Islamic State has called on supporters to target large-scale events in the past. This has included the recent Paris Olympics, but as well as the World Cup, for example, in Russia in 2018. In addition to Islamist terrorism, there is, and I would like to add when it comes to the Islamic State, that there have been cases of the Islamic State targeting large-scale events. We can just think about the bombing attacks in Paris in 2015. Other ideologically motivated forms of extremism that might affect the World Cup or might target the World Cup include both far right and far left groups. However, I would like to point out an emerging terrorism threat, which is non-ideological terrorism. This is sometimes called by the FBI as nihilistic violent extremism, and it's really a trend that has appeared over the past 2 or 3 years of perpetrators, often extremely young, that carry out attacks just for the sake of obtaining exposure without reference to any specific ideology. And this form of terrorism is particularly associated with English-speaking countries, and therefore the US and Canada. However, Mexico and non-English-speaking countries are increasingly more exposed. We can think about the terrorist attack that happened yesterday at an archaeological site in Mexico, which was likely an example of this nihilistic violent extremism, which therefore cannot be ruled out in non-English speaking countries.
And Freddie, thank you. Obvious question, really, but will recent geopolitical events influence risk levels during the World Cup? I'm assuming the macro answer is yes, but it'd be good to get more information around that.
Yes, so as Julian and Mark have covered, it's like the Middle East that is going to, or developments in the Middle East are going to shape risk landscape at the World Cup. The current Iran conflict is likely to impact the World Cup, for example, by driving civil unrest in opposition, for example, the US military involvement in the Middle East, but also in different ways. As of now, it is still unclear if the Iranian team, which has qualified for the World Cup, will attend. But if it does, its opening match is scheduled to happen in Los Angeles, which is a city that has about 700,000 members of the Iranian diaspora, which is the largest Iranian diaspora in the world. And this diaspora community has staged several protests in opposition to the Iranian regime. And it is highly likely that if the Iran team goes in place in Los Angeles, this will induce civil unrest to occur in the area. This also matters for what we could call geopolitically charged games. There is a threat of hooliganism and fun-driven violence at the World Cup.
And probably preempting my next question here with your points, but should the focus just be on Iran or other geopolitical developments likely to be influential?
Several other geopolitical developments are likely to be influential, even though we talk about them less compared to Iran. This obviously includes the ongoing war in Ukraine. Russia, as for example, staged several cyber attacks on previous large-scale events. The most notable one is the 2018 Olympic destroyer attack that targeted the South Korean Winter Olympics, which was likely, according to US analysts, a Russian-backed attack made to look like a North Korean attack. But also, in addition to Russia, there are several developments in the Western Hemisphere that could affect the threat landscape during the World Cup. For example, this includes the January US operation that captured Nicolas Maduro and the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Cuba, which, because of the large diasporas from those countries present across the host countries, could drive civil unrest and potentially forms of political violence.
Thank you, Manfredi. I appreciate that. Moving on, if I may. Just with Earth Day on the calendar for tomorrow, Josh, timely, natural disasters, vulnerabilities and challenges to state capacity. Why is disaster risk becoming harder to manage?
The natural disasters are becoming more frequent, more severe, less predictable, and increasingly outside traditional seasonal and geographic patterns. Governments, international institutions, and private organizations have largely failed to build sufficient resilience. Natural disasters have generally highlighted failures in preparedness, early warning, infrastructure resilience, and emergency response. And these failures are also creating second-order security effects, such as mistrust in authorities, public anger, and in some cases, large-scale unrest, as we've seen, for example, in the Philippines. So the implications of this are that environmental threat forecasting is generally becoming a lot harder. This is particularly since traditional risk models are based on seasonal assumptions, historical baselines, and familiar geographic patterns, which are becoming less and less reliable, which means that climate-linked disasters are now more volatile, more dispersed, and harder to model accurately. So I'll take a look at two case studies, both of which highlight identifiable and preventable failures in preparedness, infrastructure resilience, and emergency response.
Could you just expand and tell me a little bit more about the case studies and specifically for this audience, I suppose, Josh, what lessons can be learned?
The first case study was the Central Texas floods in July 2025. So on the 4th of July, intense rainfall hit Central Texas, causing catastrophic flash flooding. In Kerr County, 10 to 12 inches of rain fell within hours, and the speed of the flooding left little time for evacuation. So the immediate government response was somewhat well managed. It's involved multiple government agencies and volunteers, including the National Guard and the Coast Guard. Private companies and NGOs also filled major gaps of supplies, funding, and temporary accommodation. However, overall, at least 137 people were killed, including many children at Camp Mystic in Kerr County. And overall, it was the deadliest inland US flood since 1976. Roads, bridges, homes, businesses, and camps were heavily damaged, with most losses uninsured. So there were several identifiable failures. Firstly, this happened in a region widely known as Flash Flood Alley, so the risk was already well established. A local automated flood alert system had existed after the 1987 flood, but this was later decommissioned, and proposals to restore or upgrade warning systems were repeatedly delayed or unfunded. Authorities also became too reliant on mobile-based alerts, which are less reliable in rural areas, or as it's applied to this flooding at night when many phones are switched off. Approval procedures also delayed alert escalation, and there were several coordination failures between weather forecasters and local emergency management, which meant that there were significant delays in getting the alerts out. The second case study is the Southeast Asian floods from November to December 2025. So in late November, there was a Tropical Storm Senya, which formed in the Straits of Malacca, an extremely unusual location for cyclone development. So this was incredibly difficult to anticipate because it fell outside normal forecasting assumptions. They don't typically form in this area at all. However, the flooding affected millions, caused hundreds of deaths, and mass displacement across Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia in particular. Again, as with the Texas floods, governments mobilized significant civilian and military resources. There were military assets, emergency funds, and evacuation supports deployed in Thailand. Malaysia, there were mass evacuations, personnel, equipment, and emergency supplies deployed. And in Indonesia, emergency statuses were declared in affected regions, and naval assets, as well as shelters and public kitchens, were deployed to support relief efforts. Again, as with Texas, the key issue wasn't an absence of response. It was a failure in preparedness, warning, coordination, and resilience. In Thailand, flood defenses were overwhelmed, infrastructure was outdated, and local authorities failed to trigger evacuation measures in time, with overlapping command structures slowing alerting. In Indonesia, flood risk worsened by prior infrastructure failures such as deforestation, illegal logging, and poor land use planning. The response was delayed despite Indonesia's extensive experience with disasters. Communications outages were a major point of failure, cutting off communities and forcing the government to deploy Starlink terminals. In Malaysia, while their warnings were generally stronger than their neighbours, flood mitigation projects were still underway and incomplete. And alerts mainly focused on heavy rain. They weren't specific to cyclones, so they didn't correctly convey the gravity of the threat. There's also a heavy reliance on centralized meteorological alerts, which may have limited localized situational awareness. So in terms of the core findings from these two case studies, in both cases, the events were unpredictable. So firstly, in Texas, the Guadalupe River rose 26 feet in 45 minutes, which massively overwhelmed assumptions based on general historical norms. For Cyclone Senya, as I previously iterated, it formed in the Strait of Malacca, a location that had not produced a cyclone in approximately 135 years. So across these cases, the issue was the repeated failure of authorities to warn early enough, communicate clearly, coordinate effectively, and sustain response in degraded environments.
Just looking at sort of high-level key findings, Josh, and practical recommendations that people can take away.
Firstly, there is the necessity for a detailed pre-deployment risk assessment. This should identify the risk of natural disasters, but also safe areas, secure accommodation, viable routes, and fallback options if public systems fail. It should also assess second-order effects such as unrest, transport disruption, infrastructure loss, and communications failure. The second recommendation is independent threat intelligence and travel risk monitoring. Public alerts are generally too broad and passive. They may also be delayed, hindered by communication failures between authorities. Private sector monitoring platforms, things such as GSOCs, often provide more active models, including targeted alerts, two-way communication, welfare checks, escalation protocols, and direct support to affected personnel. The third recommendation is faster escalation and decision making. So obviously one recurring problem in these disasters was the delay caused by approval chains and fragmented command structures. So pre-agreed escalation thresholds are generally recommended. This means clear triggers for alerting, clear authority to act, and no dependence on slow internal approval when time is particularly critical. The final recommendation is a communications redundancy plan. So obviously a major vulnerability in each case was the degraded communications caused by the natural disasters. Obviously, if mobile and terrestrial networks fail, situational awareness collapses, no one can reach anyone, no one can reach help. So obviously organizations operating in at-risk areas, places such as the Philippines, Indonesia, or in the Caribbean, should consider redundant communications, including satellite-enabled connectivity, pre-positioned communications equipment, and multiple ways to reach travelers or staff should one of these methods fail.
Thank you, Josh.
Really, really useful. Appreciate that. And I know that this is a big area for a lot of wider teams and organizations as well. And actually a really good topic if security teams are looking to extend their reach into their organization around sustainability more broadly, is a great one where risk and security can add value. The data sources I can see there, Josh, you've used from United Nations. I know also, having done other work in this, the IPCC data, really, really useful for organizations to look at climate-related risks, and the Notre Dame policy, which is available also for download from Edit for completely free, looks at the risk mitigation for climate risks as well to create some type of net effect. Both of those, which I've used in previous projects. I'm happy to explore that. Julian, you kindly messaged me just to a thought come to your mind around some potential scenarios going forward for Iran. Do you just want to capture that?
First of all, I actually just wanted to add that I would need to double check this, but I think if the US and Iran both come second in their World Cup groups, then the round of 32 match will be the US versus Iran. So that's just one to watch for the World Cup. But secondly, I just wanted to say that there are some emergent threats that we haven't seen happen yet in the current Middle East conflict that might emerge later down the line. So of course there's the Houthis. They intervened in highly likely only really a performative, limited way with strikes against Israel. But I feel like we've covered that now. But they are Iran's most capable proxy. There's these strikes against desalination plants that did happen in Kuwait and Bahrain, but not in any large-scale way, and Iran could move towards that. There's the use of cluster munitions in civilian areas. Towards the latter end of the conflict, I think it was estimated that almost or above 50% of Iranian ballistic missiles launched towards Israel were using cluster munitions. Different geographies. We saw only very limited impact on Egypt, Turkey, and Azerbaijan, but we could see increasing impact there. And finally, just in terms of asymmetric threat, we've seen, just speaking in the UK, a spate of attempted attacks against Jewish targets like synagogues in London, linked to what is highly likely an Iran-backed group. But we've only seen limited asymmetric threat realize into physical harm in the Gulf states, although just the other day, I believe either yesterday or day before yesterday, there was a cell disrupted in the UAE, which was accused of planning acts of terrorism and sabotage. And I saw that Bahrain has mimicked Kuwait's policy of being able to withdraw citizenship, and that's highly likely conditioned by the fact that Bahrain has a large Shia population, but a Sunni monarchy. So we could see the development of a more asymmetric threat, i.e. small cells of actors conducting attacks and sabotage. Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, Julian. I think you raised a pretty good point. So maybe we should have a look at the options on the World Cup matches for Iran, Cuba, and US, and potential locations, dates, etc. It might be one to look at. I'll just come around the room to if there's any final comments. Mark?
In a nutshell, secondary indirect risk in this conflict related to fuel crisis and fuel shortages and protests. We've seen these observed already in Kenya, Ireland, and Philippines, so 3 continents at least. And then the other point which I forgot to say was, whilst the most dangerous threat is presented by Iranian projectiles, the most likely threat is actually yourself when you film or photograph these incoming threats. I think there was a grace period at the start where the Gulf nations didn't arrest people for doing this, and then they gave out warnings. I think that warning period is now over. We know at least 70 Brits have been arrested in the UAE, likely more. And the more Iran challenges the reputation of the Gulf states, and the more air defenses fail, the more this will be leveraged across the Gulf. And a secondary result of that would be our situational awareness of these attacks would also degrade.
Thank you, Mark. That's a really practical point. Thank you. Thank you to everyone for attending. If you do have any questions, please do reach out. For those of you who are subscribers already to our intelligence service, you'll be very used to receiving information from the team here. If you're not, please do reach out and we can discuss if you need anything access further. The last thing to say is we now have our Global Risk podcast, which please feel free to use, download, share. It is free. It captures a lot of the topics that we've been talking about today and captures a snapshot of our topics weekly. Thank you very much for attending all. Team, thanks very much, and we will see you next time.